Okay, so we will starting now. Welcome everybody to a new webinar of our series on pre-modern Islamic manuscripts. My name is Bruno de Nicola. I am a research associate at the Institute of Iranian Studies of the Austrian Academy of Sciences here in Austria. And I am the principal investigator of the project Nomads Manuscript Landscape, in which we look at Islamic manuscripts to investigate different aspects of cultural and intellectual history of Iran and Central Asia during the Mongol and early Timurid periods. A little bit about how this is going to work. I'm sure you are all very much familiar with this kind of webinars by now, but we're going to have a lecture for around 40 minutes or so. And this will be followed by questions and answers that you can either post in the chat or in the Q&A section in your Zoom, or you can also request to speak and I can allow you into the conversation and you can ask or formulate your question directly to the speaker if you prefer to verbalize your questions, in other words. Okay, so we will be recording the lecture, but not the questions and answers. So we're going to stop the recording when our speaker finish her talk. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome today Hadel Jarada, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, working in the Nomads Manuscript Landscape project at the Institute of Iranian Studies here in Vienna. She's been here for a few days, over a year now, and been focusing extensively on Arabic manuscripts and the history of Iran and Central Asia in this 13th to 15th century period we focus in our project. She has graduated recently from her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Harvard, and her interest is mostly on intellectual history of the Islamic world in general, and in particular in the history of Islamic theology and philosophy. Today, she will be presenting on a work in progress. She's been working around for this year that she has been with us, and entitled Islamic Intellectual History during the Mamluk-Ilkhanid War, the case of Marāgha and its manuscript culture. Hadel, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Let me share my screen. Right, do you see that fine?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Bruno, for the introduction and for inviting me to present my research. Today, I will be focusing on trends in intellectual history during the Ilkhanid period. My aim in this presentation is to probe the extent to which trends in intellectual discourse, which we see transpiring in Ilkhanid territory, particularly in intellectual hotspots such as Marāgha and Baghdad, penetrated the Western Islamic world, particularly the territories under Mamluk control. This presentation will depart from previous presentations within the series on pre-modern Islamic manuscripts organized by the Nomads Manuscripts Landscape Project. Instead of focusing on a single manuscript, I will examine a set of manuscripts, all of which were part of the high scholastic culture epitomized by such places as the observatory at Marāgha. This culture was primarily interested in the Islamic rational sciences called al-maqulat or al-aqliyat, which include logic, theology, philosophy, astronomy, astrology, physics, and mathematics, among other sciences. Beginning my presentation, I would like to speak about some parameters for my talk. Firstly, the political situation during the 13th century most certainly impacted the state of science and culture during this period, but did not impinge in such a way as to completely disconnect one political territory from another. This paper will try to show that to a large extent, connections between intellectuals and scholars on both sides of the political divide, in other words, both those living under the Mamluks and the Ilkhanids, persisted during the 13th century, and in fact accelerated during the 14th century. Secondly, this paper will also argue that when it comes to intellectual history, awareness on the part of scholars of intellectual trends in other parts of the Islamic world does not necessarily connote engagement with such trends. In the case of the 13th century, this talk will argue that trends in Islamic scholarship that arose in Ilkhanid territory were known to scholars in Syria and Egypt, but nevertheless, engagement with these trends was limited and often cautious, particularly during the 13th century. Thirdly, when delving into the intellectual history of this period, I intend to focus on the very context of the 13th century. In other words, I do not seek to compare the intellectual history of this period to that of the Abbasid period or the Timurid period, which I believe leads to a convoluted and not entirely accurate depiction of the historical epoch. Rather, I seek to contextualize intellectual trends within the history of the 13th century, taking into account the myriad political, social, economic, and cultural facets which went into either facilitating or impeding scholarly contact. After the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a solid demarcation between the territories of the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate materialized. The threats leveled by the Mongols against various political actors on their western border, from the last of the Ayyubid princes in Syria to the Mamluks in Cairo, forewarned these actors of the coming Mongol threat. By 1260, the Mongols invaded Syria, but were pushed back in a violent battle that witnessed the killing of the celebrated Mongol general Kitbuga. In the aftermath of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks formulated an explicitly anti-Ilkhanid policy that communicated to the Mongols the limits of their territorial expansionism. Nevertheless, during the decades of the 1250s and 1260s, important developments occurred in the field of Islamic intellectual history. Most importantly, from the viewpoint of the Ilkhanids, the construction of the observatory at Marāgha in Azerbaijan, which became the supreme higher education institution in the region. Reports from the Syrian intellectual Ibn Wasil al-Hamawi, a historian and judge active in the northern Syrian city of Hama, who was also heavily invested in the Islamic rational sciences, indicate that relationships with the East were not entirely severed. Describing Marāgha as among the best of places, his account showcased not only his familiarity with the city, but also with what would become of it. Around the same time, reports appear of scholars entering Syria from Iran, China, and Central Asia, studying with the likes of Ibn Wasil before proceeding onward to Marāgha. It was the Shia philosopher Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi who was charged with building the observatory at Marāgha by Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan and founder of the Ilkhanid dynasty in Iran. First steps were taken either in 656 or 757, in other words, the year of the sacking of Baghdad or soon thereafter. In the introduction to his astronomical table, the Ziji al-Khani, Tusi signals that the observatory's function was essentially astrological. To fund the project at Marāgha, he was given access to the money that derived from the religious endowments of Iraq, a massive sum that allowed him to gather the leading scholars and philosophers of the day, including the four he lists in the introduction to the Zij, namely Mu'ayyid ad-Din al-Urdi from Damascus, Fakhr ad-Din al-Khilati from Tbilisi, Fakhr ad-Din al-Maraghi from Mosul, and Najm ad-Din Dabiran al-Katibi from Qazvin. Despite the fact that the observatory had a practical function intended to serve the Ilkhanate, Tusi molded Marāgha to his own purposes. According to the historian Ibn Kathir, he moved many of the books protected under the religious endowments from Baghdad to Marāgha and established a house of wisdom where philosophers studied, each receiving 3 dirhams a day, and a house of medicine where doctors studied, each receiving 2 dirhams a day, and a school where lawyers studied, each receiving 1 dirham a day, and a school for the study of prophetic tradition, each receiving half a dirham a day. Tusi's budget was reported to be a sum, quote, impossible to calculate except by God, at least 20,000 dinars a year for the purchase of astronomical instruments alone after the observatory was built, a figure that today would amount to nearly $5 million a year. Not only did Tusi guarantee students a daily salary that would account for their basic needs, but he also gave them access to valuable books coming from the endowments of Iraq and membership to an academic community comprised of the leading scholars of the day. Because of the extensive budget attained by means of the influence and power that he gathered in his person, Marāgha became a much sought-after institution of higher learning. Even before 1260, the Mongol invasions of Anatolia, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in the 1240s led to a continuous stream of migration into Syria. The sociocultural landscape of the region was heavily impacted as a result. In the case of Marāgha, a report by Ibn al-Fawati, the Baghdad bibliophile who was employed by Tusi, states that when Tusi finally settled in Marāgha and the observatory was functioning, he sent a person by the name of Fakhruddin Luqman al-Maraghi, who belonged to an elite family of Marāgha, to the lands of the Arabs, where the people of Azerbaijan are reported to have fled. Such lands included Irbid, Mosul, and the Jazeera of Ibn al-Ahmad between Syria and Iraq. Fakhruddin was charged with inviting these families back to Azerbaijan. Extraordinarily, 500 families returned, some after nearly 40 years in exile. Thus, while the Mamluks fortified their border defenses to try to stave off any further Mongol attempt to invade Syria, there nevertheless continued to be contacts between the two frontiers. The bidirectionality of migration is indicated by various historical sources that report that not only did people migrate westward, but there was also those who migrated to the Ilkhanate seeking contact with their eastern neighbors for a variety of reasons. In other words, after the invasion of Iran and bordering countries by the Mongols, the political borders between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate were drawn. Nevertheless, families, persons, merchants, scholars, and refugees continued to move back and forth between these two territories, and the borders were never fully closed off to such militarily innocuous migration. On this basis, one may conclude that despite the ongoing political war, the frontier was never entirely sealed off, and people continued to make their way across both sides of the border, undeterred by the hostilities raging between the Mamluks and the Ilkhanids. The movement of peoples and goods nevertheless undoubtedly led to important sociocultural changes. The fact that whole families, rather than single persons, moved in one direction or another meant that the ethnic makeup of the area shifted. The consolidation of Mamluk power over Syria also came with changes in the sociocultural and religious landscape, which was primarily concentrated in Damascus and spread outward into Aleppo and Jerusalem. Yet the question remains, what of the impact of the political bifurcation on the intellectual history of these lands? In other words, did the demarcation and consolidation of the territorial borders between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate lead to a slower trickle of scholarly exchange and contact? Scholars from the East undoubtedly moved westward as refugees, escaping Mongol encroachment in the early parts of the Mamluk-Ilkhanid War. But in the aftermath of Ain Jalut in 1260, with the fortification of territorial borders, can the political history of these dynasties and the resulting material demarcations map onto the intellectual history of this period? Marāgha is an important testing grounds for this problematic, directed by a leading philosopher who was notorious in both East and West, and whose works were being studied in the Arabic-speaking lands. Marāgha was heavily patronized by the Ilkhan Hulagu and his successors. Mention can be made of scholars in the late part of the 13th century and early 14th, such as Qutb ad-Din al-Shirazi, who traveled from Marāgha to Anatolia and the Mamluk Sultanate. Shirazi arrived in Cairo in 1282 as an official envoy of the Ilkhan Ahmed Tugudar and took advantage of the scholarly climate there. But what of earlier decades, particularly the decade of the 1260s, when the war between the two powers was at its height and when the territorial border was being heavily fortified? Did these demarcations and fortifications influence developments in Islamic intellectual history? In the case of 13th century Marāgha, various sources provide information about the figures who traveled between Mamluk and Ilkhanid territory. For example, contemporary witnesses recount the tale of Muhyiddin al-Maghribi, a well-known astrologer who was employed at Marāgha. Muhyiddin lived in Damascus, where he worked for the Ayyubid prince al-Nasir. and was taken into captivity by Hulagu after the Mongol defeat at Ain Jalut. Al-Maghribi relayed the story of his capture to his colleagues at Marāgha, including, for example, to the well-known Christian philosopher Bar Hebraeus, who recounts the tale in his history. He states, quote, "They took us to a deep valley between high rocks, and we got off the horses. Each one of them surrounded one of us and tied our hands. When I saw this happen, I started to scream in a loud voice. I am but an astrologer, and I know of the movement of the planets. I have things to offer in the service of the Sultan, the ruler of all the lands. So they took me and made me sit behind them, together with all of their followers. And they began to kill everyone. Then they relayed the issue to Hulagu, and I was charged with serving Nasir ad-Din at the observatory at Marāgha." Al-Maghribi notes that when Hulagu celebrated General Kitburga was killed, such was Hulagu's anger that he decided to avenge Kitburga by killing the Ayyubid and Nasir and his entourage. Al-Maghribi saved himself by declaring that he was an astrologer and that his knowledge of astronomical matters could benefit the Sultan. When Hulagu learned of the case, he sent him to work for Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi in Marāgha. Al-Maghribi became a very important member of Tusi's scholarly network there and subsequently taught later students at the observatory. Another important case is that of Izz-ad-Din al-Wasiti, who traveled to Khorasan, Transoxiana, and China before returning west to Syria. In Syria, he studied with the famous scholar and judge Ibn Wasil al-Hamawi. Interestingly, Ibn Wasil was aware of activities in Marāgha, and perhaps at his advice, Izz-ad-Din al-Wasiti proceeded to Marāgha to continue his studies. He states, quote, "When I returned from my travels east, I traveled to Syria and gathered under the service of the judge Ibn Wasil al-Hamawi, the judge of Hama, and he was knowledgeable of the al-Majaz and of mathematics. He studied with him for a period and then mentioned that he left and entered the observatory at Marāgha and met with Muhyiddin al-Maghribi and studied a bit with him." Trends in intellectual history may be deduced from the actual scholarship that was produced, literature which primarily survives in manuscript form. Reference may here be made to Tusi's commentary on Avicenna's Isharat with Tanbihat. As the following analysis will show, Tusi's works and those of his students provide the most important evidence for the continuation and acceleration of scholarly contact between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate during the 13th century in the midst of ongoing war. This work, the Sharh al-Isharat, was repeatedly copied throughout the 13th century in such far-off places as Nishapur and Cairo, including this copy here, completed at the Khalifa Madrasa in Marāgha in 1262. The work was also copied in Baghdad in 1274. The Baghdad manuscript is important because of the reading and hearing certificates contained therein, which demonstrate that the work was being aggressively studied during this period. The colophon of the Leiden manuscript states that the copy was collated against the author's own copy, in other words, Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi's copy. This indicates that the work was being studied in Baghdad with Tusi, and that Tusi was moving between the two Ilkhanid capitals of Marāgha and Baghdad. The scribe Muhammad ibn Ali ibn al-Hakim al-Bayhaqi notes that when he copied the work from the author's own copy and read the work back to him. This happened in 672 in Baghdad, in other words, the very year that Tusi died. We also find another reading certificate by a certain Izz-ad-Din Abul Fadl Abdullah Aziz al-Mawsili, who was Tusi's student and originally hailed from Mosul. He notes that he was teaching the work to his own students at reading sessions that were convened in Baghdad and which ended in 1291. In other words, Tusi's commentary was among a number of philosophical works which were being studied in this area. The scholars who led these reading sessions were often students of Tusi who had studied directly under him and continued their philosophical work after Tusi's passing. And I should note here that Bruno De Nicola has a forthcoming article precisely on this manuscript, which I read and benefited from. Tusi's commentary on Avicenna's Isharat was one of the main philosophical texts circulating in Mamluk territory during the century. The Mamluk historian and biographer As-Safadi reports that the prominent judge, Jalal ad-Din al-Qazvini, who lived in Mamluk Cairo, mentioned Tusi's commentary on the Isharat and praised it in his presence. Safadi proceeded to denigrate the work, responding to Qazvini that Tusi merely took from the commentary of the Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi and the words of Sayfuddin al-Amudi and combined the two. Criticisms aside, Safadi's statement indicates that by the 14th century, the work was well known in Mamluk scholarly circles to the extent that a judge, not particularly recognized for his interest in philosophy, was debating the comparative value of the commentary vis-a-vis other commentaries. There are further reports that a student of Tusi's by the name of Shamsuddin al-Shurwani taught Tusi's commentary on the Isharat at the Sayyid al-Su'ada Khanaqa in Cairo in late 1298, early 1299. Before moving to Cairo, he lived in Damascus, where he was the sheikh of the Shihabiyya Khanaqa. Shurwani was, quote, knowledgeable of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, astronomical observation, and astrology. Not only did he report about these topics, but he would teach them, end quote. Being a direct disciple of Tusi, knowledgeable of astronomical matters, indicates that Shurwani likely worked and studied at Marāgha, and that the knowledge he cultivated there spread to the Mamluk heartlands of Damascus and Cairo by means of his teaching and travels. Another important example of the work's circulation in Mamluk territory is a response written by the Egyptian Syrian Omar ibn Khidr ibn Omar al-Isfahani, titled Tajiz and Mustajiz. Isfahani dedicated his work to the eminent Aleppan judge Ala ad-Din Ali ibn Ahmad ibn al-Athir, who was responsible for the Diwan under the Mamluk Sultan al-Malik al-Nasir ibn Qalawun. According to Isfahani, the purpose of his response was to undermine the metaphysical principles presented by Tusi in defense of philosophy, which Isfahani proceeded to do over the course of several dozen pages. The fact that he wrote a commentary during this period indicates that Tusi's Sharh al-Isharat was being circulated, studied, and discussed in Mamluk territory, a not entirely unsurprising fact given the work's popularity during this period. Another example of a scholar engaged with Tusi's commentary on the Isharat is Badr ad-Din Muhammad ibn Asad ibn Muhammad ibn Mahmud al-Yamani al-Tustari, who is reported to have resided in Qazvin, Iran, where he taught for nearly 20 years. He then traveled to Egypt and spent several months there before returning to Iran via Iraq. Badr ad-Din studied with a second-generation student of Tusi's, namely Qutb ad-Din al-Razi, who himself wrote an adjudication of the commentaries on the Isharat of Tusi and Fakhruddin al-Razi. Following in the footsteps of his teacher, Badr ad-Din also wrote an adjudication between the two commentaries on the Isharat. In addition to his adjudication and muhakamat, his deep familiarity with Tusi's commentary is evinced in an extant manuscript of the work that he himself copied in 688. Tustari was very likely one of a number of first or second generation students responsible for the circulation and popularization of Tusi's works in Mamluk territory and for the ongoing circulation of philosophical knowledge that elided the political divide between the Mamluks and the Ilkhanids. In addition to Tustari's commentary on Tusi's Sharh al-Isharat, he also wrote a commentary on Siraj ad-Din al-Urmawi's philosophical compendium, the Matali' al-Anwar. Interestingly, in his introduction, Tustari notes that the work of Urmawi, a scholar based in Syria and then Anatolia, caused much philosophical controversy in Iran. The work was being studied and glossed in Iran, and he notes that he is writing the commentary to clarify and elaborate on various issues. More importantly for our purposes, he dedicates the work to an unnamed yet clearly eminent patron, likely affiliated with the Ilkhanid elite. One retort might be that the foregoing theory regarding the continuation of a tradition of learning that elides territorial boundaries pertains to the early 14th century, after the Second Mamluk-Ilkhan War of 1299. But there is no doubt that in the case of Marāgha and the circle that surrounded Tusi, contacts between East and West persisted. So much can be gleaned from the list of students who moved between the two territories. One such student was a direct disciple of Tusi, namely Sadr ad-Din Ibrahim ibn Hammawayh al-Juwayni. He is reported to have traveled to Syria after studying with Tusi. An entry about Ibn Hammawayh in a late Mamluk biographical dictionary states that not only did he travel to Damascus, where he transmitted hadith, but also to the Hijaz, Hilla, Tabriz, Jerusalem, Karbala, Qazvin, Mashhad, and Baghdad. In 695, just before the Second War of 1299, Ibn Hammawayh arrived in Damascus, where he transmitted hadith. Had there been roadblocks to travel to the Mamluk realm, someone like Ibn Hammawayh would have been subjected to them. Not only was he responsible for the Ilkhan Ghazan's conversion to Islam, therefore indicating close ties to the court of the Ilkhanids, but he married the daughter of the prominent Ilkhanid administrator and historian Ata Malik Juwayni, author of one of the main histories of the Mongols, the Tarikh-i Jahan-i-Gosha. Further, with regard to the nature of scholarship at Marāgha, seeing as Ibn Hammawayh was a specialist on hadith and not philosophy, if we recall the report of Ibn Kathir, Tusi not only established a school for the study of philosophy, but also a school for the traditional Islamic sciences, such as the science of hadith. Ibn Hammawayh was one beneficiary of the school, being himself a prominent transmitter of prophetic tradition. On 3 separate occasions in his book, Fara'id al-Sultane, Ibn Hammawayh transmits hadith on the direct authority of Tusi, who himself transmits on the authority of his maternal uncle. Yet Ibn Hammawayh was not a lone wolf or an underdog. He is described as the Sheikh of the Sufis in his time, a major title that meant that he was a figurehead who possessed social and moral authority. His work, Fara'id al-Sultane, is about the virtues of the Prophet's household, which for Tusi, a Shi'i, would have been an intuitive topic to transmit reports about. In addition to influencing Ghazan Khan's conversion to Islam, Ibn Hammawayh is also mentioned as one of the teachers of the great Shafi'i scholar, Ad-Dhahabi, who was a foundational muhaddith and historian of the 14th century living in Damascus. The life of Ibn Hammawayh demonstrates the intellectual climate of this period and puts into question the idea that the political delineations between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate affected or averted scholarly travel, migration, and exchange. It also demonstrates that Marāgha was not simply an observatory dedicated to the pursuit of philosophical knowledge, but that it was part and parcel of a more expansive Islamic discursive tradition. Another student of Tusi by the name of Muhammad ibn Hussein al-Musawi had a number of correspondences with the Jewish philosopher Ibn Kammuna, who was from Baghdad but lived in exile in Syria. Musawi wrote replies to 7 issues he found in Ibn Kammuna's work. When he could not arrive at an adequate way to respond to some of these issues, he asked his teacher at Tusi to review his responses and to complete what was left of his reply. In utter deference to his teacher, he writes, quote, "The owner of this work, by which he means himself, was presented with questions which Ibn Kammuna had posed to him, and he was charged with answering them. So he took them to be presented to his noble highness," in other words, Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi, "beseeching him to consider them and to throw the veil of forgiveness over him for coming forth with such blabber on his part," end quote. Musawi's correspondence with Ibn Kammuna indicates that scholars living in both Mamluk and Ilkhanid territory continue to be in contact, although these exchanges were primarily centered in Syria and Anatolia. Unlike Musawi, Rukn ad-Din ibn Sharaf Shah al-Astarabadi al-Shafi'i was among Tusi's most advanced and esteemed students, who would lead lessons in his teacher's absence. He reportedly traveled with Tusi on his last trip to Baghdad, and upon the latter's death, moved to Mosul, where he lived until the end of his life. Astarabadi worked at Marāgha and is reported to have had close ties to the ruling elite, evinced in the fact that he was requested by Asil ad-Din Hassan, Tusi's son, who took on the administration of the observatory in later decades, and who was a close associate of the Ilkhans Ghazan and Olge too, to write a commentary on the Qawaid al-Aqaid, a request he duly complied with. One cannot also fail to mention Qutb ad-Din al-Shirazi. the famous scholar and associate of Tusi at Marāgha who traveled to Anatolia, where he lived and worked. At the age of 26, he left Shiraz, his hometown, for Marāgha to study with Tusi. At Marāgha, he also worked as a scribe, and a number of manuscript witnesses attest to the fact that he copied Tusi's works there. He later left for Khorasan and then Baghdad and was praised by Shamsuddin al-Juwayni, the Sahib Diwan of Ilkhan al-Baghdad. He would return to Marāgha at a later point before settling in Anatolia. In Anatolia, he studied with Ibn al-Arabi's stepson, the philosophizing mystic Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi. But more importantly for our own purposes, Shirazi was sent on an official mission in 1282 to the Mamluk Sultan al-Mansur Saif al-Din al-Qalawun, where he met with scholars in addition to persons of political interest. By the year 1359, we find a manuscript copied in Cairo that belongs to Shirazi's intellectual circle, namely a gloss on Tusi's commentary on the Isharat. Further indications of scholarly contact and exchange between the two dynastic powers come from correspondences between Tusi and a variety of scholars living in the West. Some of these correspondences are from earlier decades of the 13th century, but nevertheless show that the intellectual links were never dislodged. The scholar Alim ad-Din Abu al-Fadl Qaysar al-Sulami al-Asfuni, otherwise known as Ta'asif, lived in Egypt before migrating to Damascus and Hama. Tusi exchanged a series of letters with him about mathematics. Shamsuddin Abu Muhammad Abd al-Hamid al-Khusru-Shahi, who lived in Karak and then Damascus, corresponded with Tusi about philosophy. Husam al-Din Ali ibn Fadlallah al-Sallar al-Hayawi al-Shami, who appears to have lived in Damascus, was mentioned by Tusi in his book, Kashf al-Qina' an Asrar Shakl al-Qita'. Husam al-Din in turn responded to Tusi in his treatise, في تبيين مصادرات أوكليدس في الخطوط المتوازية. Jamal al-Din Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Sulaiman ibn Yahya al-Bahrani, who lived in the village of Sitra in Bahrain, exchanged a series of letters with Tusi about philosophy. Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi, the disciple and stepson of the mystic Ibn al-Arabi, is also illuminating. From Anatolia, he exchanged extensive letters with Tusi, which became known as al-Mufawadat. In this manuscript here, a peripheral section heading states, Kitab مجتمل على أسئلة للشيخ صدر الدين القنوي كتبه إلى العلامة الطوسي وأجوبتها. In other words, letters written by Qunawi to Tusi and responses by Tusi to these letters. Following up on these letters, Sadr al-Din wrote a treatise titled Al-Risala al-Hadiyah. The major philosopher and logician, Najm al-Din al-Katibi al-Qazvini, known as Dabiran, is also an example of the fluidity of scholarly exchange during this period. He was one of the philosophers mentioned by Tusi in the introduction to the Zij as having lived in Marāgha and worked at the observatory. Katibi is also reported to have entered Syria and to have attended the scholarly sessions of Ibn Wasil al-Hamawi in the northern Syrian city of Hama. Katibi had close ties with Tusi, evinced not only in the fact that Tusi mentions his name explicitly in the Zij, but in the letters that Tusi exchanged with him, such as correspondences regarding a treatise on the proof of a necessary existent. Katibi also exchanged letters with Tusi regarding certain issues arising out of Avicenna's medical summa, the canon of medicine. Here, the manuscript peripheral section heading states, رسالة الكاتب في المسائل المتعلقة بإثبات الواجب وإيرادات العلامة الطوسي عليه. In other words, questions that Katibi posed regarding the proof for God's existence and Tusi's responses to the questions that he posed. We also have correspondences between Tusi and his students. Most importantly, those students who moved to other regions of the Islamic world. such as the correspondence between Tusi and Rukn al-Din ibn Sharaf Shah, previously mentioned as author of the commentary on Tusi's Qawaid al-Aqaid. Rukn al-Din wrote to his teacher with various questions, and Tusi in turn responded. Some of these correspondences were sent to Anatolia, which was a popular place of migration for scholars in this Iranian intellectual tradition. And of course, Anatolia was an intellectual center in its own right. Understandably, many of Tusi's students and colleagues would go on to migrate there. One such student, Sharafuddin al-Razi, originally from Iran, migrated to Anatolia and became known as al-Rumi. He sent letters to his teacher. The section heading here states, الأسئلة الواردة من الروم وأجوبتها للمحقق الطوسي. In other words, letters sent to Tusi from Anatolia and the responses sent back by Tusi. Among the circle of scholars surrounding al-Tusi, there was also the further aim of translating his Persian works into Arabic. These translations were directed at Arabic-speaking scholars. Mention can be made here of Rukn al-Din Muhammad ibn Ali al-Jurjani al-Astarabadi, who was a student of the Shi'i philosopher and theologian al-Allama al-Hilli, who was in turn a student of Tusi's. His project seems to have been to translate Tusi's Persian works into Arabic. The translations he completed, which he mentions in an extant resume of his works, include the Ta'rib Awsaf al-Ashraf, the Akhlaq al-Nasiri, to which he gave the Arabic title Al-Akhlaq al-Nasiriyya fi Ta'rib al-Akhlaq al-Nasiriyya, a treatise on human choice titled Ta'rib Risalat al-Qada wal-Qadar, a large summa on logic titled Ta'rib Asas al-Iktibas fil Mizan, and lastly, a theological work titled Ta'rib al-Fusul fil Usul. These works were intended for Arabic-speaking scholars, likely those living in Iraq or outside the Ilkhanate who did not speak Persian. In the introduction to his translation of the Awsaf al-Ashraf, Rukn al-Din speaks about his project. He writes, أن أعرب ما أجد من كتبه ورسائله في فنون علومه وفضائله، فعربت بتوفيق الله الأخلاق الناصرية وكتاب أساس الاقتباس في المنطق ورسالته في الجبر والقدر ورسالته المسمى بالفصول وشرح كتاب التمرة لبطلميوس في النجوم وهذه الرسالة في السلوك, by which he means the Awsaf al-Ashraf. The foregoing references attest the continuity of an intellectual tradition. They survive in scholarly and historiographical works from the period, but among the texts that have not survived is a work by the Baghdad bibliophile Ibn al-Fuwati, which is repeatedly invoked in his partially extant biographical dictionary, the Majma' al-Adab fi Mu'jam al-Alqab. The work was titled Tadkirat man Qasada al-Ras, or Mention of Those Who Journeyed to the Observatory. Had this work survived, we would be in an even better situation to understand the nature of scholarly migration during this period. Nevertheless, our sources sufficiently attest to the continued movement of scholars across dynastic borders during the 13th century. However, this movement was primarily restricted to Syria and Anatolia, and only in the 14th century did engagement with intellectual trends that derive from the Ilkhanate accelerate and appear in Mamluk Egypt. To conclude, this talk has tried to show that scholarly contact between the Mamluk and Ilkhanid realms persisted during the height of political tensions during the 13th century. Nevertheless, this talk has focused primarily on high scholarly culture, epitomized by the circle that surrounded Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi. I have argued that despite scholarly contact, engagement with the Iranian intellectual tradition found in places like Marāgha was cautious and limited in Mamluk territory, but nevertheless accelerated during the course of the 14th century. My foregoing argument relies on various manuscript sources that were copied during this period, and which point to the importance of material philology for the elaboration of this history. This material allows us to reconsider the history of the Ilkhanid period and its connections to Mamluk history. Much of this raw material is available to me as part of my work for the Nomads Manuscripts Landscape Project at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And indeed, our project aims to fill the lacuna I have here spoken about, namely, to extract historical data from the raw material found in manuscript sources, which will allow us to reassess not only the nature of Islamic intellectual history during this period, excuse me, but indeed the nature of Ilkhanid history and its connections to the broader history of the medieval world. Thank you very much.